Well, can I just say, we both got our own work done on time this week.
We did.
Yeah, do you hear me how pleased I was with myself? With both of us.
Yes.
Voice there. How did you find it? So, well, first of all, what was the homework?
So it was Yinka had asked us when we done the episode on suicide to read a book called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Maxey, is it?
Maxey, yeah. Maxey, yeah.
I ordered it the day of the recording of the podcast. I ordered it while we were in the room, and it came the next day, and it was quite a thick book. So what I thought to myself was, I get the training to the city centre a couple of times a week, so it takes about 15-20 minutes. So I was like, I'll read that there and back. I'll have it read in a couple of weeks. So I sat on the train. I've not opened it. I literally just got the book delivered. Sat on the train, opened it, and within 15 minutes, I'd read the whole book. Because it's quite, if people get the book or know of it, they'll know that although it looks quite thick, there's only a few lines on each page. It was one of the nicest, happiest books I have ever read in my life. I was blown away by it. And I've spoke to a few other people who, because I'm telling everybody about it now, and a few people who read it said the same. And yeah, it was just the most compassionate book I have ever read. I was absolutely blown away by it. It's definitely within my top 10 all-time favourite books now.
Nice.
That's how powerful it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about yourself?
I had a very similar experience, Brad. Yeah, it was really had a huge impact on me. I think it was similar to what you're saying. It was full of compassion. Really interesting how it spoke to the different, core areas of for me, like the human construct. The emotions that it spoke to, empathy, compassion. Kindness. It was just kindness. Yeah. Well, that was the big theme running through it, wasn't it? Being kind to yourself. Allowing those different voices. I mean, I thought it was amazing, the writing of it. And as we say, Charlie Maxey, who wrote the book, sets it up by saying there's like a little preface in the book, isn't there, where he says how the book came about and how people encouraged him to keep writing. And for anybody who hasn't read it, obviously we don't want to kind of spoil it, but I would implore you to read this book. It's brilliant. It really is. And there's a lot of kind of, I suppose what I would describe my interpretation of is like childish drawings. It looks like a child has done the drawings that tell the story along with the written word as well. And it's just brilliant. It really is so powerful. It encourages that self-compassion. It encourages the child in you. I certainly found that, speaking to your inner child. And it's one of those things that it's so simple, and yet I think there's a lot to be said to that turn of phrase. Keeping things simple can often be the hardest thing to do.
Yeah,
and that book for me epitomised that. Brilliant. So, thanks to Yinka for recommending it, because it wasn't what I expected as well, I must say.
Definitely, yeah. I wasn't sure what to expect. Yeah. And just as we're talking, then when that popped into my head is I think we could do an actual episode on the podcast of just that book, where we could maybe read it and then talk about the emotions and feelings around it, because it really was, I found it a really powerful book. I'm so glad that I read it.
I'll be up for that.
Yeah, I can't believe it took me so long to hear about it.
Story time with Brian and Mark. Yeah, so thank you, Yinka. And I'm pleased that we did our homework as well.
Definitely. Ready to go again?
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Hello, my name's Mark.
Hi, I'm Brian, and welcome to the Therapy Shed podcast.
Hello, Brian.
Hey, Mark. Okay?
Yeah, I'm doing good, thanks. Doing all right.
Good. How's your week?
Been good, yeah. I'm doing okay. Just I would say, admiring the. Be polite and say it's lashing down outside. It's raining. But as you've said in the past, there is something, I think, quite soothing, quite therapeutic. Well, for me at least, not so much standing in the rain, but watching the rain and hearing the rain. Definitely. There's some elemental about that, isn't there? Be interesting to see if the recording, the mics pick up the rain outside. But it does sound quite nice sitting in the therapy shed and listening to the rain bouncing off the roof. I know just before is this an added extra to your therapy shed services? Just switch it on when the real power that. Just before you'd come, or as you came, I was drying the dog off from being out in the rain. Yeah. She was quite muzzy, wasn't she? But I've had a good week myself. Looking forward to today's episode. I look forward to all the episodes that we do, but specifically today, we're going to be talking about ADHD, which is something that really interests me, something that I do quite a lot of work in my private work. So I'm looking forward to these episodes. Yeah, me too. And as you say, I see you as a little bit of an specialist in ADHD. You're a bit of a connoisseur in the ADHD world. Are you saying that now? Wait till we get the guest on. I know. Yeah. Well, I'm setting you up, aren't I? But as you said, as you mentioned there, we're very lucky to have a special guest today in ADHD. So shall we introduce our special guest? I think we should, but just before we do that, I think we should mention that it's our first time of me and yourself being in the therapy shed, but our guest is coming remotely live from Zoom. So this is a new first for us, like the beginning of the series, with a first for actually having guests on, where this time today is a first of us having a guest on over Zoom. You sounded like a sports promo there as well. Live over Zoom. I've been practicing it. So let's introduce our very special guest indeed. Without further ado, our very special guest. Bear with me 1 second. Our very special guest is, welcome to Sarah Templeton. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
And Sarah, you're from the Headstuff ADHD.
Yes, I run two companies. One is called Headstuff ADHD Therapy Limited, which provides therapists who are all diagnosed ADHD. There's coming up to 40 of them at the moment. And we specialise in working with people who are either thinking they might have ADHD or people who are diagnosed ADHD and want therapy. And we found that most of those want therapy from somebody who has got ADHD themselves and understands their brain. So that's ADHD Therapy, Headstuff. And then we've also got Headstuff ADHD Liberty, which is a company, the byline of that company is fighting for your freedom from addiction and crime. So it's also working with ADHD clients, but specifically ones who have got addiction or offending behaviour issues. And we have a separate team of therapists on there who are very, very experienced in addiction, working in prisons. Several of them do currently work in prisons. We've got ex-police officers on there, current police officers on there. So it's very much a very specialist crime and addiction website with therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists on there. People who've got ADHD but have also got addiction and offending behaviour issues, and also homelessness is something that we've got a lot of experience with. So I run those companies. They're sort of separate, but there's a bit of crossover because some of the therapists work for both. But basically a very big group of counsellors and coaches who are all diagnosed ADHD and very passionate about helping people with ADHD, whether they are yet to be diagnosed or whether they've been diagnosed for a long time but still want help. That's what we specialise in. And although we're based in High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, we now have therapists all over the country, including Wales. We don't have any in Scotland at the moment. I've tried, but I haven't found anybody good enough in Scotland yet. But we've got 3 in Wales. So we cover Wales and England at the moment. And we've only been going for 6 years, and we've only got as big as we've got in the last 18 months. So we're now pretty huge, and we do cover the whole of the UK, except Scotland.
Sounds
But
really.
we do cover Scotland by Zoom. Obviously, people by Zoom are very welcome from Scotland, but we haven't actually got anybody face to face that I think is good enough yet to work for us, because I'm very particular who I will have.
Yeah, sounds really good. Sounds amazing. And I'm sure as the episode goes on, we'll get into a little bit more about as a service and sort of what you provide and sort of how ADHD fits into that. But just before we get into the core of the episode, I'd like to ask all our guests a series of 10 questions. Are you okay to answer some questions?
Totally, yes.
Perfect.
Cool. Let's go. Can I just say that when you said Mark likes to ask, it's always like to interrogate guests. It's very much a collaborative effort.
Sorry, but you seem to take the lead on actually asking the questions.
I do like to ask them, you're right. I know. Okay, Sarah. So are you good and ready?
I'm good.
Excellent. So in your own time, question 1. What is your favourite word?
Bumptious.
Say that again, please, Sarah.
Bumptious.
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 What's that mean?
Bumptious. Yeah. It describes how people could be. If somebody's bumptious, it means that they are, I should have looked it up really. If somebody's bumptious, I had a barrister, for example, who was very bumptious, you know, a bit Rumpole of the Old Bailey type characters. They would be called bumptious.
Okay.
So I just love the spelling and the bumptious of the word. I just love the sound of it. My favourite word, somebody's bumptious.
Does sound like a nice word.
It does, yeah. Thematic to that word.
I've never heard of it though. No. It's yes, I've learned something new every day.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, question 2. What is your least favourite word?
Well, my least favourite word to hear is the word sentenced, because if I hear the word sentenced, it means I've lost one of my clients to prison. And I spend my life fighting to try and keep people out of prison. So sentenced is the one word I don't want to hear.
Yeah, okay. I can imagine, yeah.
All right, thank you. Question 3. What turns you on?
Well, because of the work I do, I get turned on by people who understand ADHD, whether that's psychiatrists, teachers, CAMs, GPs, and they are a small number. They are not the majority. They are very much the minority. But when I find somebody who understands ADHD, it brings a joy to my heart, because it means that everybody who is coming into contact with that professional is going to get understood and going to get the right treatment, the right diagnosis, and the right support. So my absolute favourite thing for getting me excited is when I find somebody who really gets ADHD and is working in the field. That is very exciting for me.
Fantastic, yeah. And for me as well, I think that experience is around with ADHD, but almost with anything, you know, mental health related, and just in life really as well, is that they want to understand. There's actually a desire to understand the whether it's the concept or a diagnosis, whatever it may be. So it's getting it, but it's wanting to get it as well. Yeah. No, thank you for that. So question 4, what turns you off?
The polar opposite, misdiagnosis. That turns me off most, and it upsets me deeply because it affects people. I can give you a very good example. I have a client's son who has been diagnosed with anxiety and depression and has been on antidepressants for 18 months. His younger brother is diagnosed ADHD, but because the older brother presents differently, and the older brother is 15, I think the younger one's about 9, because the older brother presents differently, nobody has thought about ADHD for him, but he spent 18 months seriously depressed and on antidepressants. And it was, I had a session very recently that within 10, 15 minutes, when I'd asked the pertinent questions, I realised he's as ADHD as his brother, but he just presents very differently. So misdiagnosis turns me off more than anything, because I have seen it cripple lives, I have seen it cost lives, I have seen it ruin lives. For example, if somebody has an alcohol addiction, for example, and has a misdiagnosis, they will carry on beating themselves, lose families, I've seen it, lose relationships, I've seen it, lose houses, lose businesses, I've seen it all. And with the right diagnosis and the right meds, most people who've got alcohol problems don't ever touch alcohol again. Yeah. So misdiagnosis upsets me more than anything else, because it is far too common in this country, and I'm sure others, but far too common in this country. And it destroys lives. It also loses lives. People, with ADHD, we have a higher risk of self-harm and suicide. And people who aren't correctly diagnosed and on the right medication, it costs lives. So this diagnosis is a thing that turns me off most, massively, and is massively dangerous in my view, massively.
Definitely. No, and thank you again for that, Sarah, because your passion really and your experience of that really comes through there. So I really appreciate your honesty there. Thank you. So question number 5, what sound or noise do you love?
I love and adore and always have the sound of the sea. I think for some reason, this could be hereditary, because my dad, who I've worked out was ADHD and was also from Liverpool, had a deep love of the water and the sea. And whenever he moved out, he always moved to the first big river or the sea. The same. Now, I've worked out that my dad was ADHD, but he died a very long time ago, so he's never going to know that. But he was definitely ADHD, and he loved the water, and so do I. I find when I sit in front of the sea, it makes all my problems disappear. It makes somehow it makes me feel that the world is a huge, huge, huge place, and my problems, however massive they have felt, when I sit in front of the sea, they all melt away. They seem much more insignificant, because the sea is just so huge. And so I think because it's very repetitive with the waves coming in, it's some sort of calming feeling comes over me, but also it makes my problems seem so much smaller and so less overwhelming, because overwhelm's a big thing with ADHD as well. So when you've got something so big and so powerful as the sea, your own at what have appeared to be overwhelming problems suddenly become very small, very manageable. So I've always, since I was a small child, adored the sound of the sea, adored it. And I have a property on the coast now, and I love nothing more than opening the windows or sitting on the balcony and just listening to the sea coming crashing in. Adore it.
Sounds amazing.
So,
I was going to say,
definitely the sea.
Yeah, I can relate a little bit to that. I think with the sea, like the magnitude of the sea is so, it's just so vast, isn't it? And it can be so calm and tranquil, but it can also be, even when it's coming crashing down as well, there's something quite, I don't know, there's times where I like to just watch that, like the waves.
Definitely. When I lived in Eastbourne a long time ago, if there was going to be a heavy storm, we would set our alarm for 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever it was in the morning, when the heavy storm was going to come, and we would go down to the beach and watch the heavy storms. I found it amazing. I loved it. I love severe weather.
I agree.
Sounds amazing.
I think as well, just for me, kind of related back to, I suppose, more specifically, if that's the right word, to mental health. I think with anxiety, with depression, whatever it may be, our attention is obviously, as we always say with clients, when you're working with anxiety, for example, your attention is, anxiety requires you to be completely focused on the anxiety, and, and very much you withdraw and you cut off from everything else. And I think sometimes with the sea, it can connect you again. Do you know what I mean? To, as Sarah was saying, the world's a big place, and the sea is a very good kind of reflection of that, isn't it? So there's it's a good route, isn't it? Grounding.
I love going into the sea as well. I love being in the sea.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, thank you for that. Okay, so question number 6. What sound or noise do you hate?
Well, I should prefix this by telling you I'm diagnosed with sensory processing disorder, amongst other things. So what sound I hate? I think the sound I hate most, and this is going to people, but I'm going to be honest, is screaming babies or screaming children, because that absolutely assaults my eardrums. And I can't shut that out like other people can. That crashes into my head, stops me thinking anything else, because all I can hear is the screaming. And much as often, for me, it's helpful if parents trying to calm a child down or trying to cajole it or, rock it or whatever, that's okay. It's unattended children who are either with parents or not, where the parents are not doing anything to stop the situation, you know, where they're just happy to leave little Johnny screaming his head off, and you're at the next table, and I can't cut that noise out. Some people can, but when you've got SPD, it just becomes absolutely all-consuming. Yeah. And my classic example of how much I hate screaming babies, I bought a flat once, a baby kept me awake during the night, and the very first night I lived in it, the next morning I rang the estate agent and said, put this flat back on the market. She said, what? You're joking. And I said, no. I said, these walls must be paper thin, because that baby kept me awake in the night and it's just woken me up this morning. I cannot live here. Sell this flat. So she did. So that's how much I really do not like babies. I really don't. Okay. I'm afraid. I just can't. I know it's not their fault, but I just... My head can't tolerate that screaming, especially if there's no end in sight. If the parents are trying to cajole it, there's an end in sight. When it's left to roam free screaming, no, I can't tolerate it.
Okay. No, I do. It resonates. I think it resonates with most people, does it? What you're saying there as well on some level. No, so that flat definitely wasn't for you then, Sarah. No.
No, I sold it very quickly. Very quickly.
Okay. So, question number 7. What is your favourite swear word?
Okay, well, I am a swearer, and I always say to my clients when they're trying to bring their teenagers to see me, who've seen loads of therapists who don't want to come, our company's slogan is, we are jeans and t-shirt counsellors who swear too much. And when the parents see that, they go, thank God, because they don't want to sit in front of somebody else in a boring coat or a boring, you know. Mm. So we're very happy with our colourful language in my company. And I always do ask parents, you know, are you all right with a bit of colourful language? And only one in the whole history of my counselling, which is about 10 years now, only one has ever said, well, we're not too keen. We try to discourage that. And I thought, okay, fair enough. I won't do it. Everybody else goes, yes, thank God. And they crack on with their swearing themselves. Okay. So my actual, I think... the C word is a word I've never been comfortable with, but I've heard it an awful lot in prisons because I've worked in 4 prisons and I've worked with the homeless for 25 years. It's a word that used to offend me, but doesn't now because I'm so used to it. But I think my very favourite word for using myself that I do use quite a lot, and I find it's a good one for getting a lot of expression and anger into. So my absolute favourite is bollocks.
Okay, that's a great
word.
Yeah, I love that.
I just love bollocks because you can really bollock. The B is good for bollocks, and it's not too offensive, but I guess it counts as a swear word. But it's one I use quite a lot because you can get a lot of emotion into it.
Yeah, no.
So I think probably bollocks is my favourite.
Okay. Fantastic. Yes. Yeah, it's definitely a favourite of mine. Question number 8. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, funny enough, there were 2, and one of them I've just done. One of them was to write. My teacher, English teacher at secondary school, told me I should be a writer. And it was either to be a writer or it was to be an actor. They were the 2 things that I really excelled at when I was younger. Okay. I nearly got in drama school and I turned it down. Very stupid. Somebody from RADA came to see one of the plays I was in and said they would sponsor me to go to RADA, and I would skip the first audition round and just go straight in front of the decision makers. But by that time, I'd got a flat and a mortgage. I was 23 and I thought it was too old to retrain as an actor. So I didn't do it. Big mistake. I should have done it. But the second thing was I've always wanted to write. I've loved writing, and my English teacher did a strange thing once. She said, I've never done this before in my life, but I'm going to read out an essay and I want the class to mark it. So she read the essay out and she said, I want the class to say, it was my essay. She said, I want you to mark it. And at the end of it, the class said, all of them said, we'd give it A+. And she said, I've never given, this was 45 at the time, she said, I've never given an A+ to anybody, but that's the mark I wanted to give it, but I didn't trust myself, so I wanted your opinion. So she gave me an A+. That woman always said to me, you should write, Sarah, you should be a journalist or a writer or whatever. So it took until a year ago or 18 months ago for me to actually write my first book. And so writing is now one of those 2 things that I should have always done. Acting, I did do it for a long time and I did turn professional and I was good and I got nothing but brilliant views every time I acted. But I found the professional world, I found it too boring. I found too much hanging around, too much around, too many nasty people. There's a lot of narcissistic, very difficult people within the world of television, and not so much theatre. I loved theatre much more, but television and film, I didn't like it. I found a lot of directors are extremely rude, very patronising, just not my sort of people, you know. I'm a kind, caring, warm, funny person, and there wasn't a lot of humour in the acting world. They take it extremely seriously, and I did that for about 5 years, and then I worked in the theatre as a publicist for 5 years, so I'm very into that theatrical world, but I don't think my personality fitted into it, because I'm very proactive. I like to be busy, I like to be on the go, and with acting there is a hell of a lot hanging around and doing nothing and being talked down to, you know, being really ridiculed. Whereas writing, which I've done in the last year, total opposite. I was left to myself, wrote my book, and now my book's doing fabulously. So I'm halfway through my book too. So writing is the other one, and I'm really glad I've done that now.
No, thank you for that. You going to say something?
I was going to say that the next question is, which job would you least like to do? And I think acting sounds like the answer.
No, God, no, there's way worse than that. I was really thinking about that question. The worst job for me would be farmer, because I hate doing anything outside. I don't like animals. I feel filthy. And I hate being cold and outside, and I hate being mucky. So it would be anything to do with farming and animals. Worst job.
Fair enough.
No, I'm with you on that one, yeah. And finally, Sarah, question number 10. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say to you when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I would like him to say, thank you, Sarah, for forcing the government to test all those offenders for ADHD. Thank you for getting the laws changed, and thank you for emptying the prisons. That's what I'd like him to say.
Yes.
That's a good answer.
Fantastic answer.
That's the one I want. That's what I'm going for.
Why not?
Well, hopefully God's grateful for your work.
Yes, I'm sure he will.
Well, I just would like it if it's happened and someone's noticed. That would be great. I don't mind if he doesn't notice, as long as it happens.
Yeah. Cool.
Good. Thank you for answering them, Sarah. That was really good.
Brilliant.
So one of the things that we sort of start with the guests that we have on is just a little bit about your journey into therapy, mental health. It'd also be interesting, you mentioned about your dad being from Liverpool, so even maybe that into the...
tell us about him.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, my dad, God bless him, he was so ADHD, it wasn't true. And he was born in Liverpool. His entire family came from Liverpool. Mum was from Ireland, dad was from Liverpool. Same, routine, Catholic and all the rest. And I was born in Liverpool, and I'm very passionate about Liverpool. I do consider myself a northerner, like one, but I was born in there, northerner. And sadly, my mum was homesick, and she was from the south, so we moved back down south. A big Liverpool football supporter, and so's my partner, who's from Gambia, but still supports Liverpool. So good there. So basically, I got to the age of 51, I had developed a cat phobia. So I went to see a therapist. I was living in Poole in Dorset at the time. Went to see a therapist about my cat phobia. And on the third session, she said to me, Sarah, has anybody ever suggested you're ADHD? And I looked at her with a very quizzical look on my face. And I said, no, why? And she said, because I think you've got it. Go home and Google it. So I went home and Googled it. And it is not an understatement to say my entire life suddenly made sense. It wasn't one light bulb moment. It was about 300 going off as I Googled and Googled and Googled. And oh my God, this is why I interrupt people. This is why I find everything boring. This is why I don't like authority. This is why I won't be told what to do. This is why I've been self-employed all my life. This is why I've explained anxiety. This is why I've had mammoth sleep problems. There was 100 traits that all of them pretty much related to me. The only two that didn't were substance misuse and crime. I've never broken the law, and my substance abuse has been very mild. Alcohol, not huge amounts of it, and I don't drink anymore. But the rest of it, all the ADHD traits of nothing ever being enough, always wanting more, never being able to relax, being very driven, also being very compassionate, because by that time I'd worked with offenders and the homeless for about 25 years. And I never understand why I got such a buzz and so much gratitude from working with the offenders and the homeless. It meant so much to me. I always said, if give me a homeless client who's paying me nothing and who's paying me whatever an hour, I'll get much more satisfaction from helping that homeless client. But I could never work out why. So when that diagnosis came at 51, it completely explained everything, and I mean everything about me. It explained why I was overweight, because I've been a compulsive eater, and much as I'd had 2 weight loss operations by that point, neither of them had worked. They'd worked temporarily, but my ADHD brain had taken, got rid of that and been stronger, and I'd gone back to the compulsive eating. So I was very, very overweight. And I'd had all these loads and loads and loads and loads of little issues, like IBS, like migraines, like lots and lots of tiny things, but falling over a lot. I was always damaging myself. I was always breaking bones and not knowing why. And all of this, once I had my full diagnosis, which was moderate to severe ADHD combined, severe dyspraxia, which explained all the bumps and the bruises and why I dropped my dinner down my top every single night, and the sensory processing disorder, which explained why when I was in restaurants and there was a very loud table next to me, all my friends could say, "Oh, I can just ignore it. It's fine. It can just go over my head." And I'll be like, "Well, it's not going over mine. We've got to move." Once I knew that all of that wasn't me just being a pain in the neck, which quite frankly, that's what I felt like with undiagnosed conditions. I felt I was so rubbish at walking. I was forever falling up curbs or falling downstairs. I was forever breaking bones, damaging myself. I mean, if I could see my legs at the moment, you'd laugh. They're dotted in green bruises. I was constantly doing things like that. My mother accused me of being very clumsy, not watching where I was going, not doing things carefully. All these negative messages, which ADHD people get something like 20,000 negative messages when they grow up. The negative messages are sit still, focus, concentrate, don't fiddle, don't do everything so fast. I'm constantly being told to stop doing everything so fast, to pay more attention, take more care. All these thousands of messages. On that night of Googling, all of it made sense.
Wow.
So that's how I came. And it coincided that was 2015 I was diagnosed, and that was only because that counsellor pushed, because twice the NHS knocked me back and said there's no money in the NHS for ADHD, knocked me back. I thought I'll go private, went to see a chap in London, paid 450 quid. He said ADHD because you weren't diagnosed as a child. Go away. So I went away, went back to the counsellor, the classic now. She said, when I told her this, she said, "Bollocks, you are ADHD." So she's a bollocks girl as well. She said, "Bollocks, you are ADHD, go somewhere else." So by this time, I'd written out a list of all my ADHD traits, because I was getting savvy now. I knew what my ADHD was, so I'd written it all out. So I went to see another private psychiatrist who specialised in ADHD, but the night before, I sent him all my traits. He rang me up that night. He said, "Sarah, don't bother coming to see me. Don't waste your money. You're screaming ADHD. Why are the NHS not looking after you?" I said, "Because they've knocked me back twice." He, very kindly, this private psychiatrist, wrote to my GP and said, "I don't know what you're playing at, but this girl is obviously ADHD. Get her referred." And all of a sudden, there wasn't in the NHS for adult ADHD. And I was referred to a specialist 5 miles up the road. I was living in Poole. The ADHD specialist was in Bournemouth, 5 miles up the road. I sat in front of him. First, he said to me, looking at me, was, "Well, I don't think you're ADHD because, I look like I've got it together." I gave him the piece of paper, which was 4 sheets of A4 typed ADHD traits. He read the first page, flipped to the second. He went, "Oh, yeah, fair enough, you're ADHD." So I had to basically find out myself I was ADHD. He diagnosed me with inattentive ADHD. I then moved back up to Bucks. The Bucks Mental Health insisted I was reassessed, which I thought was a waste of money. But I thought, okay, if you want to do it. And plus, I'm now seeing clients in Bucks. It will help me understand what they go through with their diagnosis. Was re-diagnosed combined ADHD. And when I said to the psychologist, "This is fabulous, and I agree with you. I've done my research now. I agree I'm combined ADHD, but why did they diagnose me with inattentive ADHD in Dorset?" And the NHS psychologist said these words to me. She said, "Sarah, the NHS have got lazy. We assume that by the time you're an adult, you've outgrown the hyperactivity. So a lot of psychologists or psychiatrists will just diagnose you with inattentive ADHD." And that's an NHS person telling me that. So this is why now I work on behalf of a lot of clients who have got that wrong diagnosis. I'm seeing hundreds of them diagnosed inattentive ADHD, and they're not. They're combined. Yeah. So that was kind of my journey into it. And I'd qualified as a counsellor the same year, got diagnosed ADHD the same year, put a website up with both on, ADHD, only a very small amount of it, and started off my career working with, I didn't know if I'd ever meet an ADHD person, but I started off as a counsellor in 2016. That's when I started.
So had you already started training to be a counsellor, a therapist before your diagnosis of ADHD?
Yeah. I started training to be a counsellor in January 2010. I was diagnosed with ADHD in March 2015. So I'd already qualified as a counsellor, but I was doing my level 5 CBT. So I was at that point. So I'd gone through total 5.5 training, and nobody had picked up in that training that I was ADHD. And I don't blame my tutor for that, because she's lovely. She didn't have a clue. You know, this is the other thing. Education people aren't trained in ADHD, not just teachers. Lecturers aren't trained in it. And of those 16 of us on my diploma course, we've since worked out 6 are ADHD. And none of us knew. Yeah, 6 out of 10.
And this is part of, obviously, why we like to do these, topics for each podcast episode, Sarah, because I think a huge issue, really, and certainly from what you're describing there, it certainly applies to ADHD. A huge issue is awareness, and not just awareness.
Yes.
In general, shall we say, in across the public, but also awareness in the field, in the clinical field, in the medical.
Absolutely.
Field. It's actually trying to hopefully improve awareness, improve our knowledge. Certainly, Brian and myself included, in what does ADHD look like? What does it sound like? What's it present like? How do you diagnose it? Why is it misdiagnosed? So that's something I want to come on to in a moment with your good self. But if you can just briefly tell us as well about because you mentioned, obviously, you've got your business, which you've had for a few years now. So from your backstory there, your own personal journey, I would guess that was a huge driver for you to set up Headstuff.
Well, no, it wasn't. That's the funny thing. When I qualified as a counsellor, I didn't think at that point I'd ever met another adult with ADHD in my life. It's since transpired that my partner and all my friends are ADHD, but I didn't think I'd ever met another ADHD person in my life. Yeah. So I did a website, and I just put one page on there about ADHD, with my thinking being, I'll probably never meet another person with adult ADHD, but I'll stick it on there just in case. From that day to this, we have been, it was gentle at first, but it started, one of my first clients was a 13-year-old who'd just been arrested for armed robbery. And his mother rang me and said he thinks he's got ADHD. I don't, but he does. So he came to see me. He hadn't been the robber or the armed person, by the way, but he was in a group of 7 and they'd all been arrested for it. And he came to see me, and he was screaming ADHD. I mean, really severely ADHD, that boy. He'd worked out himself from Googling. He'd worked it out. So I gradually started with one client, and then it built and it built and it built and it built. And now, somebody said about a year ago, you must be the biggest team or company of ADHD diagnosed counsellors in the country. And it suddenly hit me that possibly we are. I don't know of any other, put it that way, where everybody else is diagnosed ADHD. Do you know what I mean? It's just, yes, there's loads of coaching companies and counselling companies, but we're a bit different because nearly all our coaches are also qualified counsellors. There's only about 2 or 3 that aren't, and those are very highly qualified in coaching. But the vast majority of us are counsellors who are diagnosed ADHD, and that would appear to be quite unique. But I just fell into that completely by accident. It was no great business plan of mine. We just got approached, we because I very much believe in helping people. Now, that might sound, all counsellors help people. No, I go further than that. I go very much outside the bounds of counselling, and always have done. So because we do that, because we will do letters for parents to schools, because we will do letters telling CAMS they've got the diagnosis wrong and they need to relook at this child, because we go outside those bounds of counselling, and we will help the parents and the clients in whatever way we can. I always say to my girls and boys, if it's legal and if it's in the client's interest, do it. Because we will go outside those bounds. I'll give you a very good example. Client of mine, 15, wanted to be a footballer. Mother said, you're going to have trouble being a footballer because of your anxiety. He did have extreme anxiety and ADHD, ASD traits, and several of the dyspraxias as well. And I went outside the bounds of counselling by going to his, trial, his football trial, because he said he wouldn't go if I didn't go. And I said, well, I'll come with you if you want. And it was a rainy Monday night, a really rainy Monday night. But I went and stood with his mother on the pitch, on the side of the pitch. And he went in, that boy. It nearly killed him getting in the door and getting his uniform on and going on and everything. But he did. And he got signed up. and he's now in his second year of training to be a professional footballer. Now, that to me is in the client's interest, and it was legal and it was in the client's interest, so I did it. And that's what our company is very much about. You know, we are ADHD counsellors. We all think outside the box. Yes, we're all professional. We're all qualified. We've all got supervisors and we're all insured. Yeah, all of that. But if it's in the client's interest and it falls outside the bounds of counselling, so be it.
Fantastic.
And that's why we're a bit different.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's very much more than a counsellor. You know, you're working very much on a human level with the
yes.
Well, not that counsellors, of course. Of course, that's kind of a core of a counsellor, isn't it, to work on a human level? But it sounds like you're very much practical support as well as emotional support.
Yeah, we are practical support. Yeah, and I think because a lot of us are coaches as well. You know, within the coaching world, that's absolutely acceptable. And also actually within the CBT world as well. You know, when I did my CBT training, if somebody has a problem with trains, it's perfectly okay for you to go with them on the train if that's what it's going to take to get them on the train. So I've kind of taken a bit of my CBT training and taken the coaching training as well. And as I always say to my therapist, you know, as long as you are both safe, as long as it's in the client's interest, and as long as it's legal, go for it. Because some of these things that we do for the clients, I'll give you other examples. You know, we have a lot of clients, counsellors rather, who work with addiction, and some of those clients will not go to their first AA or CA or whatever meeting on their own, and our therapists will go with them to get them in the door. They will go with them. Yeah. Because if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes.
That's to achieve the overall goal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good.
Yeah.
I think with you know ADHD, a person with ADHD, sometimes because of what you said earlier, Sarah, about the amount of negative comments they've had about their sort of behaviours, or what we now understand as traits, is that sometimes people, we know, don't we, that people who have not had the support with ADHD often also have very low self-esteem and low confidence. So I think
absolutely
service that just gives them that little bit extra, it probably makes a huge difference to
absolutely
the journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
So can I ask then, which I think to bring it right down to, what do we call it, right down to the basics. The first question, I think lots of people, and as you've just mentioned, Sarah, it's not necessarily people who've never engaged or have no kind of previous understandings of mental health or clinical support. Just right across the board, it can apply to anybody, whether they're in mental health or medical professions or not. What is ADHD?
Okay, ADHD, well, for starters, it is not a behavioural disorder. Yeah, that one has to be thrown out the window. There are
Sorry, say that again, Sarah.
It is not a behavioural disorder. There are still some people who think it's a behavioural disorder. It is not. It's a neurodiversity. It's a different wiring in the brain, akin to autism, but not autism. Yeah? So what is different in an ADHD brain is we don't have enough dopamine. And dopamine is the pleasure hormone. So in a neurotypical person's brain, they have a pool of dopamine, and the message that dopamine is giving to the brain is everything enough. I don't need anything. I don't need to walk or talk or shout or fight or eat or get drugs or get drink or food. I don't need anything. Everything is enough. Yeah. In an ADHD brain without enough dopamine, our neurons are firing all the time, looking for that extra dopamine. And where they get that dopamine is from anything exciting or anything that gives them a thrill. Yeah. So for a lot of people, that is food, especially when they're younger. It's food, or it's climbing up climbing frames too high, or it's climbing up trees too high because they get a buzz from it. And that quietens this brain because they get a buzz. Yeah. Mm-hmm. As you get older, if your ADHD is undiagnosed, more people turn to crime, weed, alcohol, drugs, all sorts of drugs, risky behavior. So anything that will thrill seek and risk take, that will give your brain the adrenaline buzz. So for example, I've got lots of clients who do skiing, who do bungee jumping, my brother's ADHD, he cycles. A lot of ADHD people cycle because they can cycle really fast and they get that adrenaline buzz from cycling. Anything that is exciting, basically, this thing loves. So For me, it was food and shopping. That's what mine loved, buying things, getting new things, because new things are very exciting. So ADHD people fall into 3 categories, yeah? The biggest category is ADHD combined, and I'm in that category. The other 2 categories are what traditionally was thought of as girls' ADHD. That used to be called ADD. It's now called ADHD inattentive type. And also they found it's not just girls. There's a lot of boys with it, including my brother. Inattentive people tend to not have the hyperactivity element, although they can still have very, very busy brains. But they're not so hyperactive as they're running up trees and climbing on people's garages. They tend to be more sedentary, but they are very dreamy, very daydreamy, very lost in their own world. They're usually extremely nice people that people would people who find themselves around inattentive ADHD people usually would say they're very quiet, they're very in their own world, they're very dreamy, but they're harmless, really kind, gentle people. They're very much in their own world. They're very distracted a lot of the time. Yeah. This is generalizing massively, by the way, but just to make it sort of clear for your listeners.
Appreciate that.
The third kind is what is traditionally thought of the boy kind, but you can have girls like this, but really this still is predominantly boys, and that is the hyperactive and impulsive. Wow. Now, that type, those boys are ones, everybody had them in their plans when they were infants. They were the boys that didn't stop running, the boys that were constantly knocking into you, the boys that had holes in their trousers because they were always falling over, the boys that were rude to teachers, the boys that were chucking chairs at teachers. Basically, they've got far too much adrenaline. They just don't know how to get enough adrenaline. They haven't got far too much adrenaline. They've got far too much energy, and they don't know how to get rid of it. So they get rid of it by running around, by shouting, by screaming, by throwing chairs in the classroom, by being naughty. And that's how they get their buzz, because they need a real buzz because they've got so much energy. So that's why they're called the hyperactive and the impulsive. They don't think before they do a lot of stuff. But the biggest group of all of those in the UK is by far the combined. So people like me, I'm very inattentive. I don't notice things. I constantly bump into things, drop things, break things, lose things, can't find things. I'm doing all of that, which is the inattention. But then I'm also hyper in that I do everything on the go. I've got an internal motor that doesn't let me stop. I'm driven. Nothing is ever enough. I always want more. I want to achieve more, do more. I never have enough holidays. I'm never thin enough. Nothing's ever enough. I'm constantly seeking that. But now I'm on meds, that's a lot reduced. And also, before I was on meds, nothing was ever enough in the food front as well. I could never eat enough. So however much I'd eat, I'd always think I fancy something else. I'm full, but I fancy something else. I didn't realise that was my brain saying, you've given me 10 cakes and 10 bags of crisps, and that was gorgeous, but I want more. That's your brain pushing on. So that's why so many people with weight problems and quite, usually people with not just half a stone or a stone overweight, people who've got big weight problems, it's often because of the compulsive element of the ADHD brain. They don't know that that's why they're very, very overweight. And I was one of those.
Right.
I didn't do it with drugs and alcohol, but I did do it with food and shopping. They were my 2. And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people wouldn't necessarily connect sort of misusing food and having an unhealthy relationship with food with ADHD. People they wouldn't. They wouldn't. And it's funny because I've had 2 weight loss operations in the past before I knew I was ADHD, and my bariatric nurse, who's a very, very well-known nurse in this country, she's a real bariatric specialist, and she had a major weight problem of her own. I think she lost about 20 stone when she had surgery. I've sent her the ADHD questionnaire, and she's seriously ADHD as well, as I knew she would be.
Oh, wow.
And I tried to educate her on it. I said, because you are going to be seeing a lot of people that are coming to you for bariatric surgery, whereas actually, if they got the right diagnosis and the ADHD medication, the binge eating would stop. I stopped binge eating 6 years ago, and I was a terrible binger up until that point. Couldn't control my appetite. It wasn't appetite. You were full, but you still had to keep eating. It was very difficult to explain to people. But now I know that that's ADHD. I had one client many years ago who'd been at the Priory for 9 years being treated for an eating disorder. She came to see me. In one session, I worked out she was ADHD. She went back to see that man at the Priory and said, look, my eating is ADHD. And that man straight away booked a session in with me, because I thought, being at the Priory, he might think he knew better than me, but he didn't. He went home and he Googled ADHD. He then apologised to her for wasting 9 years of her money. Can you imagine what she was paying? Yeah, she's now diagnosed on the ADHD medication, and she's no longer a compulsive eater. So
it's sorry, go on.
I was just going to say what other sort of, and again, I know this is quite a generalized question, but what other sort of common symptoms would you associate with ADHD?
The common ones are addiction. Addiction is full of people with ADHD, and it will either be, it's usually alcohol. Very often, it's more commonly alcohol actually than it is drugs, because alcohol's legal and easier to get hold of. Food is a big one. Gambling is a very big one. A lot of gamblers have ADHD. I know many that have lost everything through gambling. Absolute tragic stories. Lost families, wives, businesses, houses, cars, everything. Another big one is promiscuous sex. So I've had many a client who's come to see me who adores their partner, absolutely adores them, can't bear to think of losing them, but is having affairs and hates themselves for it, but can't stop doing it. Now, once they know, that's because that's the way they are getting their dopamine rush, their excitement. And once they're diagnosed and medicated, that's not going to be the case. You know, the relief. I've had many, many people sobbing in here. It's usually men. I have had women, but it's usually men who adore their wives, been with their wives for 20, 25 years and still very much in love with them, but can't stop having affairs and taking risks when it comes to extramarital relationships. That's ADHD. And another big one that people don't realise is workaholics. People who can't stop work and are very driven. And I mean, my partner, when I got him diagnosed, he'd got 3 jobs. And work is another way that people get that buzz, you know, from working hard and achieving lots and getting new clients, and they get the buzz from that. Overwork is a big one. Also over-exercise. There are some people that are absolutely obsessed with exercise and can't stop exercising and get very thin and very obsessed about it. That's another way of people getting the buzz, because you get adrenaline when you exercise. So you have to look basically for anybody who's doing anything to the extreme, because it won't be just a standard exercise or a standard drink or a standard worker, but anybody who's working to the extreme, drugs, alcohol, bankrupts, people that can't stop spending. And I know people that have been literally millionaires and ended up with nothing, because they just couldn't stop spending it or gambling it. So anybody who's doing anything that is impairing their life and they're doing something to the extreme, that's what you look for, because that is potentially ADHD. And you definitely look for it in addiction, always in addiction. You always look for it in homelessness, because homeless people, what's their problem? They can't keep a tenancy. They can't pay money regularly. They can't stay in one place all the time. They get itchy feet. They want to move. Nothing's ever enough. They want to move on, and they can't usually control their money. Excuse me, because they're either spending it on alcohol or drink, or drugs. Excuse me. God, sorry, frog in throat. That'll need editing. But yeah, anybody who is doing anything to the extreme that is impairing their life, look for ADHD, because it's possibly there. Yeah. So,
just because I want to ask you as well about your work in prisons and the prison system, and you mentioned before you've had a lot of experience with that. But just to ask quickly before we move on to that, Sarah, you've got the questionnaire that can help identify, that can help diagnose ultimately ADHD. To answer that question in a clear, concise way, as I say, for ourselves and obviously for any listeners who may be uncertain on this. How do you diagnose ADHD?
Well, how do you find out if you are? First of all, you go online. There are some fantastic ADHD tests online, and they're all accurate as far as I'm concerned. I haven't seen one that's dodgy. So a lot of people who think they're ADHD, they go online and they start researching it and they do some of the tests, and that's absolutely fine. There's none that are incorrect. But what I found when I went into the prisons, I was doing my placement. I'd already worked in a prison for 18 months and found that I got on brilliantly with all the men and the boys. That was an adult prison, that one. Couldn't work out why I got on so brilliantly with them. Then when I did my placement in a young offender unit, and I was thinking at first, young offenders, oh my God, young cocky teenagers. I thought that's what I was going to be going for. And when I met all these 19, 20-year-olds, I got on with them like it was like magic. I always explained it was like magic. I understood them. I understood why they loathed authority, why they despised being told what to do, why they took risks, why they thrill seeked. And what I didn't realise at first, until I was diagnosed, but it was because nearly all of them were ADHD. And of my 6 clients on my placement, I worked in a young offender unit. And I had 6 clients. Of those 6, 3 were diagnosed as children but had been taken off the meds, and the other 2 I've gone on to get diagnosed on the outside. So that was 5 of 6 were ADHD, and there's only 1 who I don't think was ADHD out of the 6.
Wow.
So 5 out of 6.
So, but just to answer, as I say, just to understand, when you say you got them diagnosed or you helped them get diagnosed, what is that in a literal sense? What does that look like?
Well, in a literal sense,
how
it should work is you go to your doctor and say, I think I've got ADHD. A doctor will then give you a tick box form that they've been provided with by the adult ADHD mental health services that they've got. And if you tick enough of those boxes, you then get referred and you wait on an NHS list. Now, the NHS waiting list at the moment, I don't know anywhere where it's less than about 2 years. And in some places, it's up to 9 years. So that's what you do. You sit on an NHS waiting list, or you go privately. And there are more and more private psychiatrists these days. They don't charge ridiculous amounts. We know ones that will charge anything from about £400 up. And those you can be seen within 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So the vast majority of people go privately for an assessment now, and that's children and adults.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. And I think it's helpful as well, certainly for myself, and obviously I'm sure for a lot of listeners as well, just to get a practical level, what is the process? What does it tend to look like? So no, thank you for that.
Yeah.
You mentioned before, Sarah, because that's been really helpful for me as well. I know Brian's a lot more experienced and knowledgeable than myself on ADHD, but I really feel like I've got an understanding of what it looks like and what the lack of understanding in the field. You going to say something, right?
I think as well, it's probably, I feel like it's important for me to sort of say that. Although I done my one of my placements in the ADHD Foundation, so that's where I started working as a therapist with people with ADHD, but I've also got quite a number of family members who are diagnosed with ADHD. So as a parent, I also know what it's like to go through the process of getting a diagnosis. And it can be, I was somebody as a dad, obviously my son has got ADHD. I had some knowledge of ADHD, and even I found it difficult going through the process of getting a diagnosis when it was clear that my son had ADHD, not only because of the traits that he had, but also the fact that there's at least 4 or 5 family members who have got diagnosed and maybe 1 or 2 others undiagnosed ADHD. So, it can be quite a...
Sorry, Brian, I was just going to say, and comes back to Sarah's, sharing her personal story before, her personal experiences, the impact of a misdiagnosis or an undiagnosed, and the shall we say, the obstacles, the complexities that it sounds like, the barriers that are put in place in trying to at least explore that diagnosis are just unbelievable, aren't they? Can be so problematic and have such kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? So it can be so consequential, do you know what I mean? On many levels, just that lack of understanding, that lack of, sounds like refusal in some ways too.
But I think like what Sarah was alluding to earlier on about, you say to somebody who doesn't know about ADHD, what is ADHD? The first thing that most people will say somebody who's really hyperactive, and it's often followed by, or really naughty.
Yeah.
Now, for example, my son, he's not hyperactive. He during when he was younger and in school, he did get into trouble. But that was more, in my opinion, because the school didn't understand his ADHD and didn't understand his needs, rather than him being naughty. He's not a naughty child. He's
spot on. Yeah, I know him personally. And he is. He's not someone that I would remotely think of as a naughty kid at all. No.
But he was misunderstood, and the school didn't know how to support him. But bringing it back to the diagnosis, I think unless the person goes into the room where they're being diagnosed and they're not bouncing off the walls, it can often say, well, that's not ADHD because they're not hyperactive. I
see. So that kind of I want to say like lazy stereotype, that misunderstanding, shall we say, of ADHD actually further hinders,
I think so,
diagnosis or encourages a misdiagnosis, because the stereotypical traits are you have to be uber hyperactive and really naughty and really this and that. And if you're not those things, then you're ADHD, which, as we're finding out today, is clearly not. It's not as simple as that, and that's not the case.
Yeah, I think so.
No, but thanks for that, Brian, as well. I think because it's, obviously that's personal to yourself as well, but I think it's really helpful to realise that this affects everybody, doesn't it? In different ways.
I'm not sure how happy my son's going to be. I've just announced that he's got ADHD. To be honest, he'll be okay. He embraces it. He knows which is something that we'll get onto as we go through the episode, but he knows the qualities that allow him to do certain things in his life that he wouldn't be able to do if he didn't have ADHD. So, for him, he's at that age now where he's okay with it.
Embraces it, yeah, fantastic. So, Sarah, you mentioned before about you've got extensive experience working in prisons, and you just mentioned again about you working in a youth offenders unit, and you've touched on it, how prevalent it sounds, the way you're describing how prevalent ADHD is in those areas. I just wondered if you could give us a little bit more of an insight as to what that, why you think maybe that's the case, and
it shocks me that it's the case. Yeah, it shocks me that it's the case. It's absolutely tragic. There is somebody I know who's a mental health nurse and has worked as a mental health nurse in the prison service for 20 years. She estimates that there are 85% of the prison population have ADHD. Now, when I was in
85%,
85%, and she is a mental health nurse who has worked in the prison system for 20 years. So now, from my experience, which is a lot less than hers, although on the outside, I've worked with offenders now for 25, 30 years, and I've worked in 4 prisons. My guesstimation in young offender units, it's a good 80, 90% of them. I totally agree with her there. It really is. In adult male prisons, I don't know. If somebody had asked me, I would say it's well over 50%, but I wouldn't know how much over 50%. She's convinced it's 85. I just know it's over 50%. And also, although I've never worked in a women's prison, I have worked for different addiction services on the outside. And I've seen women coming out of prison and straight into those addiction services. And every woman I've seen that's come straight out of prison, I would hazard a guess, is also ADHD. Every single woman I've seen. So it's as rife in the women's prisons as it is. In fact, one of my therapists works in a women's prison right now. And she says, Sarah, it's as rife in here as it is in the prison. So
I just ask Sarah, sorry to interrupt you, just quickly there on that point. Is it, well, I suppose two kind of questions that are related. Is it true, or is it, again, like a lazy kind of stereotype that males and boys are far outnumber females in terms of ADHD diagnosis? Is that true?
Traditionally, more boys have been diagnosed. They believe that it's roughly 50-50 girls and boys have got it. But the reason boys are diagnosed more is because, generalising, boys manage their emotions less well than girls. Right, so, for example, when I was at senior school, I was constantly accused of having attitude. I thought everybody was an idiot except me. I thought the teachers were thick. I hated my mother. I was very negative and arsey about everything. Yeah. But that's as far as I went. Now, the male equivalent of me was probably saying that to teachers, punching walls because he was angry, kicking the odd thing, and he would probably have been picked up because boys have obviously got testosterone that comes in puberty. So girls often get accused of being more, well, you've got the dream. So you've got the ones that dreamy in their own world and doing no harm to anybody. And then and they're not being picked up because they're no harm to anybody, including the teachers. So they're not picked up. Then you've got people like me who are just a bit gobby, a bit arsey. My maths teacher refused to teach me. She made me sit at the back of the class where I sat and did my homework quite happily because I hated maths. Had I known I had dyscalculia at the time, we'd have known why I hated maths, but nobody had bothered to diagnose me. So I sat at the back doing my homework. So I was just arsey, and annoyed and frustrated and irritable and hated everybody. But I wouldn't have got a diagnosis for that. I was just accused of having a horrible attitude, and constantly at home and at school being told I'd got a horrible attitude. I didn't know what attitude I had. I just thought I was being me. Well, I was being me with ADHD, undiagnosed, and that was attitudey. But the equivalent of me, the boys, they were punching people and pushing people over and being less in control of their emotions. So shouting more, swearing at people more, kicking things more, punching. So yes, they did get diagnosed more. But are there more boys with ADHD than girls? That's the big question. Because until everybody who has got it is diagnosed and we will never know. I think from my 10 years experience of it now, because I've got more experience of that if you go back to when I started mentoring, because all the people I mentored, the homeless people years ago, they were all ADHD as well. I now look back and it's so obvious. They were in and out of prison, couldn't keep a tenancy, all on drugs. It was all the signs were there. But right. I wonder, I suspect if you had to ask me, I would suspect slightly more boys who've got it than girls, but there's a heck of a lot of girls that have got it as well. It might be something like 60-40, 60 boys, 40% girls, but it's nearer 50-50 than the 3 in 1 would have you have, because up until a few years ago they were saying it was 3 boys to every 1 girl.
Yeah.
Nah, there's more girls than
Do you know what, I just wanted to ask you, Sarah, about the prison situation and people being in prison with ADHD. Is there something about with prisons around sort of structure and routine that when people reoffend and go back to prison without a diagnosis of ADHD, something about the structure and the routine of being in prison that
yes,
that makes
they like it
safe?
They like it. Yeah. They like it. They kick against it and they'll scream about it and they'll try and they'll bang on and on about release. And when I get out. And then when they get out, they can't cope. Because I've seen this numerous times, because they're so used to having somebody tell them what to do, what to eat, when to go to bed, no bills to pay, no washing to do, nothing. They can't cope on the outside world. So that's why a lot of them, the unmedicated, either undiagnosed or the diagnosed but unmedicated, that's why they end up going back into prison very quickly, because they can't cope on the outside world.
Because I know, and again, I don't want to lead into this too much at this point because I know we're going to talk about it, but with therapy, like traditionally, and I always start with this approach, CBT is seen as quite a good therapy to use with somebody with ADHD because it is quite directive, structured. There's the routine side of it, rather than being, say, person-centered, where it's a bit more free-flowing and around, sort of, there isn't that structure there. Yeah. And I think I find I get a really good response from clients with ADHD using more of a CBT approach, where it is more
100%. 100%. I've got 2 things to say about that. When I went for my placement at the prison, the very first question the psychologist asked me was, how entrenched are you in person-centered theory? Because I was doing a person-centered diploma, because I stupidly didn't know there was any other that you could do at the time. I just went to my local college. So she said to me, how entrenched are you in person-centered theory? And I thought, oh my God, I've got to really think about this, because I desperately wanted to do that placement in that prison, desperately. And I didn't want to get the answer wrong. Mm-hmm. So my answer was, I said, I like it as far as it goes, but for me, it doesn't go far enough. And she said, right answer, because it doesn't cut it here. That was her exact words. So like you, Brian, I'm a massive fan of CBT for ADHD. I think it works for lots of reasons. 2 of the biggest problems with ADHD is overthinking and ruminating. We can overthink and ruminate ourselves to misery and to anxiety and to depression quite easily. We're fantastic at overthinking and ruminating. So with a lot of my clients, I've done CBT, and recognizing their unhelpful thinking styles is massive. Once you've got an ADHD, of the 12 unhelpful thinking styles in CBT, I do 11 of them. And when I tell clients that I was a terrible catastrophizer, terrible black and white thinking, all of this stuff, that CBT works, I think, phenomenally well on ADHD for ADHD therapists to use. Get them to understand. And the classic, a thought is just a thought, not necessarily a fact. When you're dealing with clients who have thousands of thoughts every day, and when you get them to realize that, yes, they're thoughts, but they're not necessarily facts, I've seen that change clients' complete perception. completely change their life when they just realise that all those thoughts aren't facts. And then when you do the unhelpful thinking styles, that's enlightening for ADHD people massively. And then if you've got somebody who is, say that somebody's got a phobia or an issue that they actually want dealing with, ADHD people love structure. So if you say, right, this week, let's say you've got a depressed person who won't leave the house. So this week, all I want you to do is open your back door. That's all you've got to do. Nothing else. Just open that back door and look out of it. Because our brains are thinking a million thoughts at a time and they get very, very overwhelmed very easily. If you structure it with CBT and you break it down into really tiny, little achievable steps, that works brilliantly for ADHD people. Because they'll just walk out and think, all I've got to do, nothing else, all I've got to do is open that door. I can do that. And then, the next week when you say, and I want you to put one step on the outdoor sport, they can do that. So the structure works for ADHD people. Much as we kick against it, much as we hate being told to do, and we don't want structure, you give a structure. And if it makes sense and it's going to help us, we function way better in it, which is why a lot of ADHD people flunk university. Because if they've been through school, they've had the structure of the mum giving them tea, telling them when to do their homework, telling them when to go to bed, driving them to school in the morning, they get their A-levels. They go to university, suddenly they don't have to get up. They don't have to they're cooking for themselves. They can go partying. Whop, it all falls apart.
And that makes so much sense, that, Sarah, it really does. And the other thing I would probably say as well is universities tend, just on an academic level alone, as you say there's a lot of the personal boundary, your personal private life, your boundaries, particularly if you're a young person going to university, you've got a hell of a lot more freedom than you probably have had in your younger life when you're in school and college. But the other thing as well with universities is they tend to be a lot more self-directed on an academic level as well. You're expected to, construct your own timetable, as in when you do your work and how much reading you do and what you read, and it's very much the responsibility is often placed on the students more so in university than it may be.
ADHD girls, generalising, are much better at that. ADHD girls much better at organising themselves and getting to lectures and all the rest of it. On the generalising terribly, but boys on the whole who've had a lot done for them by their mums, they are not so good at it and they're very disorganised. One of my coaches, he did a degree and he got given an award at the end of it for the student who passed the degree by attending the least amount of lectures. He only attended.
I'd love that achievement.
ADHD, not diagnosed at the time, but is now severe ADHD as well. He only went to 30 lectures over 3 years, but he got a first. Now that's ADHD for you, We will usually do things by the seat of our pants and we will achieve in the end, but we'll go about it a very different way. And that's typical. But a lot of people, you hear numerous ADHD people. I had one this week who've started degrees. I've got one this week who started 3 degrees and not finished any of them. And that one was on meds, but not on a high enough dose. This is another problem with medication. People with ADHD get put on meds and then they think, oh, that's it, I'm on it now. They don't realise they're put on a starter dose and you have to go up and up and up usually to find the right dose. So there's a huge problem around medication and the cost, because if people have to go privately, which a lot of them do because the NHS, I'm not criticising it here because it's amazing, as we know, but up until 2009, adults were not diagnosed with ADHD in this country. So all the adults that have realised since 2009, you're talking the entire population of 60 million or whatever it is, who have realised that they're ADHD, they've all gone and said, I want to be diagnosed, please. And the waiting lists are ridiculous because up until 2009, there was no service. So it's only been for the last, 12 years, or my maths is rubbish, but 12-ish years, that people have been able to ask for an ADHD assessment, which is why services are swamped. So people do have to go privately if they want it. An ADHD trait is wanting everything now. Can you imagine saying to an ADHD person, you've got to sit on a 2-year waiting list? It's not going to happen. They're going to go private, which is what I did. You just go straight to private.
Encourages that sense of what's the word for, you were talking before about challenging those boundaries and feeling uncomfortable with authority and that sort of thing. I guess
exactly. We don't know until we've got to wait 2 years, thanks. We want it tomorrow. And ideally today.
You mentioned medication there, and I just want to come back. if we can for a moment, to talking about your work in prison service and working with young people, and you mentioned about how prevalent ADHD is in prisons, but you mentioned medication there as well, and something that you shared with us is the what should we say, the problem with either a lack of medication or restricting medication for, and this is just people who are diagnosed with ADHD, when they enter prison, sometimes the medication can be restricted or even taken away. Is that, am I remembering that right? Is that true?
It's not restricted. They're either allowed to be on it or it's taken away. Most times it's taken away.
Why is that? Why is it taken away? What's the rationale?
Well, primarily because boys sell it, because it has street value, big street value in prison, because it's stimulant medication. It's the equivalent of speed. Right. So it has street value. And what was happening was boys were taking their medication and then bringing it back up and selling it to people. So a lot of prisons, all the prisons I worked in, all 4, none of them were on their ADHD meds. None of them. They'd all been taken off them. However, I have heard of prisons where they are allowed to be on their ADHD meds. And usually what they're trying to do now is Elvant, which is one of the big ones, comes in a capsule. If you split the capsule, you can put it in a drink. So if you make them drink their medication, then they won't, even if they did bring it back up, it wouldn't work on somebody else because it's so diluted by then. So getting them to drink it is a really good idea. And there's somebody I know who is very passionate also about getting boys diagnosed in prison. And I go to the APPG at the Houses of Parliament. I'm on the committee for ADHD. And another member of that is somebody who knows a lot about the prison service as well. And he's ex-police. And he says that the prison should be guided by the NICE guidelines, and everybody with ADHD in prison should be allowed to have their ADHD meds. Fair enough, we accept that the pill version, they may well sell it, so don't give it them. Give the one that they have to break it into a capsule, put it in a drink, and they have to drink the drink. That's what he's pushing for, and I quite agree with him, because that medication he's pushing for everybody to be on, all the ADHD ones, is actually the top one that the NICE guidelines recommend for ADHD. So it's not as if it's some random expensive one. It's the one that everybody should be on anyway. And as you can give it to people as a drink, the boys in prison should be on it as a drink. And I go with that. I totally agree.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
another interesting thing, when I was working at Portland, some of the boys were getting out and they had a lot of anxiety. They were all diagnosed ADHD. They had a lot of anxiety about getting out and, functioning on the outside and everything. And several of them said, I can cope if they don't give me my ADHD meds back, but I can't cope without my anti-anxieties. And this is back years ago. It's not as much used now, but in those days, a lot of them were on pregabalin, because pregabalin, anything with the word GABA in works on ADHD because it's our GABA receptors that are affected. Right. So pregabalin used to really calm their anxiety. And there were boys that I worked with, specific ones I can remember, that were euphoric, that the prison put them back on their anti-anxiety meds literally in that last week before they were due out, but they wouldn't put them back on their ADHD meds because they've got value. But I have heard there are prisons now where boys are on ADHD medication. I've actually heard that. There are some, but you'd have to do a survey to find out exactly. From what I hear from, as I say, I've got staff who work in prisons, and it's still most common for them not to be put on their ADHD meds when they're in prison, which is the equivalent of somebody with epilepsy having their epilepsy meds taken off them in prison. It's a drug that is needed for their brain to work properly. Yeah. And because ADHD has such a stigma around it, some people still think it's naughty boy syndrome. Some people still think it's a behavioural disorder. Not many realise that it's a different brain wiring, exactly as autism is, but a different brain wiring to autism. And it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. And therefore, we need medication in our brains to get them to work properly, the same as somebody with epilepsy needs it in their brains for their brains to work properly. People with epilepsy are not taking off the medication. ADHD is always seen as the poor relation. It's always seen as the one with the stigma, the one that you don't want to talk about having, the one that you should be ashamed about. This is when I was diagnosed and I put it out there, I was incredibly proud, and I still am, of being ADHD. I think it makes me special. It's no coincidence that most millionaires, all entrepreneurs, most famous people, most comedians our ADHD, because we are the life and soul of the party. We are funny. We are driven. We don't like boring things. Thank you very much. We do want the exciting things. You know, we're good, fun people to be around.
Yeah. Can you give us some examples? Some examples.
Examples.
You mentioned
examples that everybody will know. Everybody knows Ant and Dec. Ant was diagnosed ADHD approximately 3 years ago when he had his very, very visual breakdown, when he split up from his wife, when he had an alcohol problem, when he crashed his car at the time. He was seen by some psychiatrists. He was diagnosed ADHD. So Ant of Ant and Dec, big one. Another big one, Mel of the Spice Girls. She did an interview with Piers Morgan about 2 years ago, and I thought, my God, I hope psychiatrists are watching this and can realise this girl is screaming ADHD. Well, obviously somebody was, because within about 3 months.
Just to like me, which one is it? Is it Mel C?
Mel B, the black one.
Mel B, right, okay.
One who lived in America with an abusive relationship. Now, that's another indicator of ADHD. We're much more prone to being in abusive relationships. So she was the one who was in the relationship where she was controlled and coerced, etc. She is now diagnosed ADHD. Other very famous people, Zayn Malik, who was in One Direction. He was ADHD. And anybody who remembers the auditions, he missed half the auditions because of his anxiety. Couldn't get on the stage, couldn't do it. Simon Cowell kept dragging him on. Drag, he's got an amazing voice. But he's ADHD. Then when you hit Hollywood, Tom Hanks is diagnosed ADHD. Woody Harrelson is ADHD. Cher is diagnosed ADHD. Whoopi Goldberg is diagnosed ADHD. Justin Timberlake is ADHD. Will.i.am is ADHD. I could go on forever.
Wow.
Just so many famous people. And in England, the comedians, Rob Beckett, Rob Beckett, the blonde one with the teeth, diagnosed ADHD. Russell Brand is diagnosed ADHD. Lee Mack is diagnosed ADHD. There are way more positives about having ADHD, in my view, than there are negatives. Way more.
Sorry, Brian, you want to say?
I was just about to say that, definitely, I think there is way more positives. I think what makes the difference is the support and getting it recognised and diagnosed as early as possible.
You said to me before, haven't you? It's about the right support at the right time is crucial, isn't it, in the person's life?
Yeah, I think so. If I had to sort of do a perfect scenario of what somebody, and I'm talking about a younger person here, sort of support they should get if they had ADHD, would be a coach to help them manage routine, how to manage the sort of the structure in the life, the life and things like that, and then a therapist to help them deal with the emotional side of things. I think if everybody was able to get that, I think they would.
I think it's crucial, because there's, something we haven't touched on, but the biggest impact of ADHD is not impulsivity, inattention, distraction, hyperactivity. It's not. It's the emotional dysregulation, and anybody with ADHD will tell you that we struggle with our emotions. The bit in the brain that's supposed to regulate emotion, ours doesn't work. So we can't regulate emotion, which is why there's a higher suicide rate for people with ADHD and a higher self-harm rate. We can't regulate our emotions. So when you're talking kids, when I explain that to little kids, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, they can understand that because they know they get upset for no reason. They know that they can cry more than their friends. When you explain that to them, that's not you being weak or anything, that's your ADHD. And actually, when you grow older, that is going to go in your favour because it means you care more. You're going to be more compassionate about other people. You won't put up with bullying, So if you can get kids to understand those ADHD traits when they're very young and see that although they do give them problems, there's nobody denying that, but when they are managed properly, medicated properly, and when the child understands them, they can be used to their advantage. And that's why I'm always telling kids, all the ADHD stuff you've got, the nasty bits can be medicated away and you're left with all the good bits. And there's a lot of good bits, know. Ask Tom Hanks if he thinks he's got a disability. I don't think he thinks he has. Ask Whoopi Goldberg if she thinks she's got a disability. These people are massively successful because they're ADHD. You know,
and you mentioned there as well about emotional regulation and dysregulation, and it just something's come to my mind. Then was something you mentioned a moment ago with Mel B about being in an abusive relationship, and you said that's very sadly very prominent with.
We're more prone to it,
And I guess that emotional regulation, our relationships with our emotions, if you're struggling with that, I would, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say sadly, you're probably more vulnerable to someone exploiting your
100%. 100%, but it also goes with low self-esteem, because
but sorry, I was just going to say, you're striving for that connection, but at the same time, you're very emotional, and unfortunately, some people can.
Yeah. And also we jump into relationships very quickly before we find out enough about the person. I've been in a controlling and coercive relationship only for 2 years when I was 19. Typical, cut me off from all my friends, wouldn't let me see anybody, wouldn't let me work, very controlling. And in the end started to beat me up. So I left him. But most people with ADHD have low self-esteem around some areas. Like for me, I know I'm brilliant at some things, absolutely appalling at others. But I've self-esteem around certain things. So it's our low self-esteem that makes us vulnerable to people who are more controlling and coercive, narcissistic people. We're like moth to a flame to them, because they can spot the weaknesses in us and they can abuse that. There are an awful lot of ADHD people I know who have either been in or are currently in abusive relationships.
Mm. And as you say, that sense of self-esteem, self-worth, self-tolerance, self-understanding, it's such a huge component of mental health. I know this was something we're going to come on to now, is the importance, like Brian mentioned before, the importance of emotional support. So therapy is just invaluable, isn't it? And but for me, that talking about ADHD and self-worth, I think I've worked with clients. One particular client comes to mind now, and this client was super bright, super kind of proactive, really engaged in lots of different clubs in school and college, and was trying to be a leader in different things. And I'm not a big fan of this term, but just for want of a better description, was super productive in her life, and had developed essentially OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so we worked on that. She came to work with myself, and I'm a CBT therapist, so we came to work with myself. We got some brilliant work done, and it basically come to light that, and certainly talking to yourself today, I think we were spot on, both myself and the client, certainly, that she had an ADHD, a possible ADHD diagnosis, which was subsequently was fully diagnosed. And just listening to you talking then about the importance or the significance of self-worth, that was something she actually said that to me towards the end of our work together. She said, "You know what? I thought my self-worth was absolutely fine. I thought that I was pretty comfortable with myself." She said, and that was not what I came to therapy for at all. But when we kind of did our reflections, in the last few sessions of therapy, on the course of therapy, we did our reflection on what she felt like how our experience of CBT had gone, and any changes. And we, really tried to put that in, which I do with all my clients, try and put that into a bit of a toolkit, obviously, to come towards therapy. Mm-hmm. And that was something that she never envisaged at all, and she found was just as important as tackling and overcoming OCD, was just that. The
OCD will be connected to ADHD. It comes from overthinking, doesn't it? OCD. I just wanted to say something about what Brian said earlier about having the right support in place. I have just written a book, as you know. I know you know. I've just written this book called How Not to Murder Your ADHD Kid. Instead, learn to be your child's own ADHD coach. And I wrote that massively to help parents, because the parents who understand their ADHD child's brain and what works for it, what doesn't work for it, how to, for example, always to give it options, never tell it what to do, give it 3 choices, because ADHD likes to choose and be in charge. I wrote that book especially because I work with so many 18, 19, 20-year-olds, parents who didn't understand them. And I wanted to get to the parents before it got to those kids being in prison at 18, 19, 20. I thought if their parents had understood that them being arsey, like I was, being rude, wanting everything now, having no patience, being clumsy, dropping things, losing things, if they known that was the reason, if they'd have known how to work with that and manage that and get it medicated, probably these boys wouldn't have ended up in prison. So I thought, I've got to get to these boys earlier than this. This is 18, 19, 20. It's too late. all the damage has been done. So I wrote the book, How to Not Murder Your ADHD Kid, specifically for parents of young. And I've said, buy this buy this as soon as you can, as soon as you realise it's potential ADHD, read this book, because the more you understand about their brains from when they start kicking off at 3 and fucking things and you're telling them off, if you can understand why they're doing that and manage it this way, not that way, you won't give them low self-esteem, and they will grow up understanding their own brain and how it works. And that's what I'm praying. I mean, the book is selling really well, which I'm beyond overjoyed about. I've got to literally send one this afternoon to Hong Kong. Can you believe? It's selling all over the world.
Fantastic.
And I'm just thrilled to death, because I just want the parents of ADHD kids to read this book, because it will tell them exactly what's going on in their brain. It's not just... Sorry,
Sarah. I was just sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, and you mentioned at the beginning of this episode about your own kind of personal backstory, and you said with the benefit of hindsight now, your dad was kind of, you said, was like nailed on ADHD. Is it true that ADHD is often hereditary?
It's nearly always hereditary, unless it's caused by brain damage, either at birth, or some people tragically have car accidents or something like that. Brain damage can cause ADHD. Otherwise, it's hereditary. Every single child I've ever seen, it's been in the parent, either one parent or both parents. Wow. Massively hereditary. So this is the other thing that the book's doing. I'm telling it to the parents, and the parents are reading it and going, bloody hell, actually me. I can't believe it. And because ADHD presents so differently, so a lot of these parents say, but, I'm not like him. I don't bite things. I don't chuck chairs at the door. I don't punch things. But, and then the mum will say, but I've never been able to sit down. I'm always on the go. I can't relax. And my mother was a workaholic, and my father was an alcoholic. And you think, well, there it is. There you can see it going all back to the family. But because some people control it better, like that mum, but her son's kicking off. And this happens in families as well, where one child, I've had this week, one child is severely ADHD and diagnosed. Other children in the family think, well, I'm not like him. But actually, this week, I've got one who's been for 18 months been on antidepressants, because he's not like his brother, but it doesn't mean he's not ADHD. It presents in so many different ways.
Because it presents in different ways. It's not it's not picked up maybe as...
And it's
exactly.
So some people can have more severe, traits compared to somebody else. So
the severity of the traits can vary. The number of traits you've got can vary. There's so many variables. A psychiatrist once said to me, Sarah, he said, ADHD is a very big umbrella and a lot comes under it. And that is so true. There's so much that comes under it. The comorbidities. I mean, the comorbidities can include dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, social anxiety, OCD. There's so much can come under it. Alexithymia to dyslexithymia, ASD or ASC, autism. So much can come along with ADHD. It's unbelievable. And if you find all that out at the beginning, which is why I've written this book, to try and say to people, look, even if you get a diagnosis of ADHD, look further. There's bound to be some comorbidities. 80% of people with ADHD have got one comorbidity, and 50% have got two or more. Don't stop there at the ADHD. Look for what else is going on. And I'm very passionate about that book, and I really wrote it for clients. I wrote it to give to clients, but we stuck it on Amazon, and it's now going bonkers. So it's now going to go in bookshops and everything, because it's just going absolutely mad, because the parents... I've written it very, very down to earth, and I said, look, I've got ADHD myself. I do all these things. It's all about, when your kid steals, when your kid nicks. And I said, I used to nick things. I used to steal. I used to lie. And this is why I did it. And I tell them why I did it and the best way to handle it. So the book, much as I thought it was just a simple little book that was probably going to sell to clients, it's actually going bonkers and selling very well all over the world.
And it really is. It's brilliant. And it's, I think, one of the key kind of impacts of a book such as that as well, and hopefully in a small way that podcasts like this can do something similar, is to destigmatize. It's just hopefully just highlight, shine a light on ADHD in this instance, and just destigmatize it as well. So encouraging people to explore and talk about it, because that's how we learn. And that's how. And certainly now, we've said this on previous episodes. There's the mental health resources, mental health, the field of mental health has got a long way to go, but it has come a long way as well. So let's.
But I don't underestimate therapy, because it was a counsellor that spotted my ADHD, and had she not said to me, "Has anybody ever suggested your ADHD?" and me go no, and her say, "Go home and Google it," I would not be in the position I'm in today. And even when I'd been knocked back twice on the NHS and once by the private chap, it was her that said, "Bollocks, Sarah, this is wrong. You are ADHD. Go and get diagnosed." Had I not had the strength of that counsellor with her conviction that I definitely had ADHD and she was not going to take no for an answer, she was absolutely right. And that woman changed my life. She's amazing. I still adore her. She works for my company now. She was my supervisor.
Oh, wow.
She was my counsellor. She then became my supervisor for 5 years. And now she works for me, and she's amazing. I absolutely adore her. She changed my life. She gave me my life. She gave me the knowledge of who I was. She was amazing. So counsellors, I'm massively passionate about them being aware of it as well, because you can massively change someone's life. Massively.
I had someone, just as an example. I had somebody come to me with ADHD, and what had happened was they'd been to see another therapist, and during the therapy session, the client wanted to stand up and move around, and the therapist said to them, you're not taking this seriously. You need to sit down and stop fidgeting. So basically, they didn't go back, as you can imagine. And he came to the session with me. I was like, "Listen, let's go for a walk and do the therapy. If you don't want to be sitting in the therapy shed and having therapy in here, let's go for a walk." And, it's that understanding can make such a difference, and that's not just
definitely.
It's in the prison system, it's in the school system, it's in society in general. But certainly, I'm a firm believer in. Obviously, it's my job, but the amount of people I work with ADHD, they ask me about medication. I say, give it a try. It's not for everybody, but certainly what I believe you should do is, when you go into your doctor, is they give you a trial of medication, 2 or 3 months, see if it works. If it's for you, great. If it's not, that's okay. Try therapy, CBT, coaching, hypnotherapy, whatever it might be, because I think with the right support, people, like you've said, Sarah, with ADHD can achieve a lot. It can become a superpower, isn't it, as it's known?
Absolutely. There's millions of very successful people with ADHD. And not just that, but a lot of my counsellors have got masters, PhDs, we can highly achieve with the right support and the right knowledge. We on the whole, ADHD people are very bright. We're not daft, most of us, but we've just got issues like dyscalculia, dyslexia, whatever, that once identified, we can sort them out and move on.
Yeah, because ADHD doesn't correlate against intelligence. You can be super intelligent and still have ADHD, or you can be low intelligence.
Yeah, but Brian, you still get doctors who sit in front of people to this day who say, "You've got a degree, you can't have ADHD." That still happens regularly, and it's wrong.
And that proves again, doesn't it? That it's important. It's so important and necessary to destigmatize ADHD, because there's somebody who's done X amount of years in medical school and is obviously a GP, so has achieved really well, and even there are still examples of, shall we say, a lack of understanding of ADHD. So
if they were trained before 2009, they were trained that it was a childhood behavioural disorder.
Yeah.
It's only since 2009 the training has been to include adult ADHD.
And what's sort of that is, I've worked with doctors who have diagnosed ADHD. I've worked with pharmacists diagnosed with ADHD. I've worked with my last client was. One of my last clients with ADHD was a nuclear biochemist or something.
Oh, really?
I don't even know what the job was.
Sounded good.
Sounded good. I had a neuroscientist in my therapy room this week with her ADHD son, and we worked out she's got as well. You don't have to be thick to have ADHD.
No. Sarah, just you mentioned about the book, but what's the book called again? And where can
the book is called, and if I've got half a brain, I'll have it here now to show you. It's called How Not to Murder Your ADHD Kid. Instead, learn to be your child's own ADHD coach.
And where can you get that from?
At the moment, you can get it from Amazon, you can get it from eBay, and you can get it direct from our head office. But we're just negotiating, and it should be in shops. I think it's going to be after Christmas. I'll be very surprised if it's before. But at the moment, Amazon, eBay, or direct from our head office on our website.
Brilliant.
Most people get it off Amazon.
Really?
Yeah.
And I just want to say one other thing about the likes of, books and, another really good book that I love to tell, especially younger people to look at is All Dogs Have ADHD. I think that's a really nice book that helps children understand what...
It does, but somebody who's on my website, Solly Lazarus, she's just written one called ADHD is Our Superpower, and that's a really good one. It goes through all the different traits, and it's all about different children who've all got different superpower traits of ADHD. Okay. So I personally, I've seen All Dogs Have ADHD. I think that's all right. I personally think Solly's is better because it relates to children with their different superpowers, which are ADHD traits. So have a look at that one as well. ADHD is Our Superpower. That's a good one.
And the reason why I mentioned sort of books and sort of therapy as well, and speaking to people who are aware of ADHD, sometimes just one little thing that can be said that can make such a difference. Like an example would be, I'll often say to parents, if I'm working with the children who have ADHD, the things like, the most common one is of a morning, trying to get the child ready for school, and it's like, go and brush your teeth, put your tie on, put your shoes on, and you come down and you've put the tie on but forgot to put the shoes on and brush the teeth. And it's trying to teach the parents that, give one single command, go and brush your teeth, and then when they brush
that's
teeth,
in my book. That's in my book. It's in my book. That we can't hold too many instructions in our head at once unless they're written down. Right. So that's why I really encourage if any parents are listening, read it, because it does explain exactly what an ADHD brain can handle and what it can't, and why it can't, and different ways of doing things.
We'll have to read this book. We'll have to order a copy. You can sign it.
Well, that
signed copy, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you said you wanted a little challenge to do at the end of the show.
Yeah. Yes. Put us to work. What's our homework?
That is your challenge. Your challenge is both to read my book.
Okay.
I'll send it to you because I'm all about raising awareness, and that will raise your. I mean, Brian, I know you know a lot, but it will raise your awareness as well. And you especially, it goes through all the, one of the first chapters is all the ADHD traits they never told you about. And there's loads of traits in there that people don't know about. So that's my challenge, is for you to read that book. It's short, it's easy to read, it's short, chunky chapters. It's not great long textbook. Even ADHD people all say it's easy to read. Yeah, so that's my challenge. And I will happily send you that. Send me your addresses and I will send you the book.
Thank you so much. Challenge accepted. We will read that and we will reflect back in our next podcast. So thank you very much. And for people out there, please do check out Sarah's website, Sarah's company, Headstuff ADHD Therapy.co.uk. You can read all about Sarah's service and her backstory, and obviously it's all ADHD informative there as well. So do check out the website as well as the book, of course. Yeah. Sarah, is there anything you would like anything we've missed or anything you'd like to share?
No, I would just like to thank you for this opportunity to speak about it, because like I say, I am all about raising awareness and all about reducing the stigma. The stigma doesn't affect me. I'm very out and proud about having ADHD, massively proud about it, but it does affect a lot of other people. And I would like people to stop judging, stop seeing it as a behavioural disorder, stop seeing it as naughty boy syndrome, and I understand that there are phenomenally intelligent, bright people who struggle because of their ADHD. And the only reason that a lot of them aren't diagnosed is because up until 2009, we didn't diagnose adults with ADHD in this country. That's the only reason. And now we are diagnosing. Hopefully this is all going to get much better, but there's an awful lot of older people without. I've had people in my therapy room, 72 was the oldest, a man who just realised he was ADHD. So you're never too old to find out you're ADHD, never too old to get it medicated and treated. And for people to just Google it and have a read, and don't judge. Don't think of it as naughty boy syndrome and all the boys in prison are with it. Yeah, they're all in prison with it because they're not diagnosed and medicated. They're all actually lovely people. On the whole, vastly, they are lovely people who didn't have good enough parents, or not good enough, but didn't have aware enough parents to realise that they needed to get them diagnosed and medicated. And that's largely because the parents are ADHD themselves and they didn't know they were ADHD either. So it just goes back and back and back. So to stop judging people that are in prison with it, or addicts with it, or who are homeless with it, stop judging them and start realising that they've not been diagnosed, they've not been medicated, and had they been, their life very probably wouldn't have gone in that direction. So I'm very grateful for you to letting me talk to other people today, and I hope it helps people understand that we're not all naughty. And on the whole, we're very lovely and we're very compassionate and very kind and caring, but we don't like boring things.
You've certainly come across all those things, Sarah, and you are very welcome. Thank you very much for your time, certainly for your knowledge and sharing your story so passionately and so honestly. I've certainly learned a lot. And I think one of the key themes we're trying to do with these podcasts is to normalise and encourage conversation, encourage, as you say, destigmatising all areas of mental health, and to encourage people not to be judgmental, including ourselves, of course. You know, we can all be judgmental. So encouraging that destigmatised in order for us to learn about each other, but most importantly, learn about ourselves as well. So I certainly feel like you've done that today. So thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think
great pleasure. Lovely to meet you both, and thank you for having me.
All the best. I'm sure we'll speak again. Thank you, Sarah.
And on that
okay, pleasure. Take care. Bye.
Next time.